Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen. Welcome, or welcome back, for another tale from the counterculture. Actually, this time it's a tale of just pre-counterculture. It's the tale of the Teddy Boys, who emerged in Britain in the early 1950s, becoming the country's first distinct youth subculture. In the aftermath of World War II, these working-class teenagers rejected post-war austerity and embraced a bold, rebellious style of dandyish suits, long drape jackets, narrow trousers, velvet collars and patterned waistcoats, and of course, pomaded quiffed hair. Their look was a direct challenge to the drab, conformist styles of the time. They soon became Britain's first rock and roll fans, embracing the sounds of Bill Haley, Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry. Their sharp fashion and love for American music set them apart from mainstream British society, where youth had previously conformed to family and work expectations. The Teddy Boys became notorious in the British press and got associated with violence, clashes with rival gangs, their alleged involvement in the 1958 Notting Hill race riots. But was that really the case? They certainly laid the foundation for future youth movements, proving that teenagers could form their own cultural identity, shaping Britain's rock and roll scene and inspiring later subcultures like the mods and the rockers. But before we hear all about them, I want to say thanks to these countercultural kids, Chris, Pat, Kate, James, Polly, who wrote to me this month with appreciations and suggestions. Thank you. We love hearing from friends. You can join them. Join us at bureauoflostculture.com. And speaking of countercultural kids, my guest today is Max Decharne, fellow musician and author, member of Gal and Drunk and the Flaming Stars, and writer of books on all things countercultural: King's Road, The Rise and Fall of the Hippest Street in the World, Capital Crimes, 7 Centuries of London Life and Murder, Rocket in My Pocket, The Story of Rock and Roll, A Dictionary of Hipster Slang, and most importantly for today, Teddy Boys, Post-War Britain and the First Youth Revolution. We're going to talk about the Teddies, but also about the mods and a bit about punk, the massive influence of rock around the clock, and working class fashion. All right, let's go. Welcome, Max. Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, well, listen, I gave a bit of an intro to you and your multivarious career there, but why don't you give a better intro to who Max Decharne is?
It's funny, if I write a book, then it tends to say in a couple of sentences, writer and musician. And then if I put out a record, it tends to say musician and writer. And there's always this thing of, if you're doing one, you're not supposed to do the other. Mick Jagger went and made a film in the late 60s, and, the press were incredibly snotty about it when he did, because by the time Performance came out, that was 70. He'd already starred as Ned Kelly.
The gangster.
Really annoyed the Australians.
Right.
You get somebody who's not Australian to play. Yep. And he took a lot of flack for his acting in that. And I think David Bowie got a lot of that when he was, even though Man Who Fell to Earth was superb, and we try not to mention Just a Gigolo. But the idea is that if you do one, you're a complete dilettante in the other.
Yeah.
But I'm both. So I've done a lot of records. I've been kicking around in bands since I was a teenager, since the late 70s. My first book came out 1989. So that's a while ago now.
Just on that point of you've got to be one or the other, I'm not sure that's true anymore. I mean, look at Nick Cave. Of course, we think about Nick Cave as a musician, but he's put out a lot of books, hasn't he?
Yeah, he has. Yeah.
And there's that thing about musicians writing memoirs, but you don't write memoirs. You write books about things.
I will. Give me time.
Also, in the brutal economics of these times, it's quite difficult to just be a musician, isn't it? It's quite difficult to just be a writer, actually. Yeah,
I think you're right that people are more used to people doing different things.
We should talk about your book, which is in front of me, one of my favourite books this year. Obviously, we're only in 3 weeks in of this year, but I don't take that as a barbed compliment. Teddy Boys, Post-War Britain and the First Youth Revolution. I mean, you've written many books, and actually this era, in a way, the 50s and 60s is an era which you've specialised in counterculture. Yeah. But let's talk about the Teddy Boy, because for me, an absolutely fascinating subculture. And would you describe the Teddy Boys as the first youth culture in this country?
Over here, yes. You do have a strand of working class flash culture that goes back to the 19th century, definitely. In 1896 novel, The Child of the Jago, in the working class of the very, very desperately poor people in around Shoreditch High Street. Some of the novel is describing their flash stripes You'd go to your local tailor, just as the Teds later did, just as the Mods later did, and these trousers were described as being cut saucy with a bang-up fakement down the side, and a fakement is a musical term for, or a carnival term for decoration. Yeah, the idea that you would walk down the street as a moving exhibition, basically, sort of like a challenge to anyone who could see you. You're running the risk of some other people thinking you look like an idiot and wanting to batter you on the strength of that for looking different. But also you're going to get admiring glances, not just from people of your own sex who think, oh, I want to look like that, but also people of the other sex going, hey, that looks like an interesting person, whether it's a teddy boy or a teddy girl, or whether it's the wide boys of the 40s or the wide girls of the 40s. So you do have that. It was around the spivs, the racetrack gangs. A lot of these people were dressed in a way that polite society thought was not quite proper, too exaggerated. Kind of thing. It was okay if you're wearing it on the stage. Your musical comedians, Max Miller, people like that, they were wearing garish colours, exaggerated. You know, if a lapel is supposed to be 2 inches wide, well, let's have one that's 4 inches wide in 1941. If you've got a check suit, there's like a moderate check. They'd have one that jumps out at you.
This word flash is quite interesting because you get this, Flash Harry.
I mean, he's a Ted in the St. Trinian's films. George Cole is definitely wearing Teddy Boy gear, but he's called Flash Harry, and that is because those books predate the Ted era. It's an older term, yeah.
Yeah, the notion of flash is quite interesting because, as you say, you're walking in the street, basically you're drawing attention to yourself.
Yes, getting above your station.
Right, it's a social crime in some way,
totally,
right?
Yeah.
Particularly if you're from the working class or even the underclass, you might call the criminal sect, actually. So to do that, you're actually making quite a statement, even if it's just through your look. I mean, everything else about your existence might be pedestrian, depending on what you do.
Sure.
But you're actually investing some of your hard-earned cash into projecting a different sort of image.
Absolutely. And the only people traditionally who were allowed to do that were the wealthy. And if you go back to medieval times, there were certain types of clothing and colours you could get arrested.
You weren't allowed to wear certain types of clothes if you're from a certain station.
As a peasant, if you wanted to wear like bright red or certain things that, it was the royal family and the aristocracy, and that was it. And they would lock you up. It was seen as a provocative gesture, like almost along the lines of impersonating a policeman. You're impersonating somebody who's wealthy. Clothes were very valuable. If you read the newspapers that survived from the 18th century, the posh were getting mugged for their clothes in mid-18th century London. A flash lace collar or a waistcoat or your trousers. I mean, or your wig. Wig wearing was completely normal for men. And
so wig stealing was an established crime, is it?
Yes, it was. You see the highwaymen robbing stagecoaches. The rich were left shivering at the side of the road. Everything they were wearing was worth a silly amount of money.
Right. In history, in this country, and I'm sure it was true in other countries, clothes themselves somehow suggest your class in the medieval times that you're talking about. It's not just that you're impersonating somebody who's, an aristocracy, but you're also threatening the kind of structure of society.
Totally.
Right? Because we want to be able to see from a distance which class you belong to.
Are you one of us? 20 years ago, retired, I interviewed John Peel, who had his teddy boy era. He had drainpipe trousers. He said the working classes were supposed to dress in what he said mud colours, not draw attention to yourself. Ted Carroll, the great Ted Carroll, who founded Ace Records and Chiswick Records, and who used to manage Thin Lizzy, and he was a teddy boy in Dublin in the mid-50s. He saw the Bill Haley tour in 1957. He said before Teds came along, before rock and roll, they were just people. You got out of short trousers at school and you were expected to then dress like your parents. This is the working class we're talking. Whereas you could go to Oxford or Cambridge, look at Cecil Beaton and all of his friends, his great photographs of his social world, upper class world, or certainly most of his friends did in the 20s. But they're all into dressing up extravagantly, and that's okay. The wealthy could be a dandy, they could be an eccentric, they could decide they want to dress up all the time as Henry VIII or whatever it might be. And that had always been tolerated back to Beau Brummel or the circle around the Prince Regent.
Well, not only that, but I mean, certainly in the aristocracy, there would be a whole structured tradition of what you wore during the day.
Oh, totally, yeah.
So, for instance, you wear something in the morning, like a morning coat or a morning jacket. You would possibly change into something for the afternoon,
Yeah.
and then you definitely change for dinner.
Yes.
So you might be wearing 3 different outfits in a day.
If you're in the country, you would not remotely wear what you wore in town.
Absolutely not.
And there are members of the aristocracy who still do that.
Of course, yeah. And yet, taking it back, and even after this era, particularly when you get into mods, and then certainly maybe leapfrogging the 60s, put straight into punk, and even the New Romantics, you see that a lot of the fashion developments in this country in terms of how young people have come from the working classes.
Absolutely. There were a mixture of classes involved in punk. There certainly were in the sort of 60s pop culture revolution. But Ted's, that was working class start to finish, which is one of the reasons why they've never been rehabilitated. There was not a figure, for instance, like Tony Wilson at Factory Records in the punk days. He was respectable and he had the access to television. So he was able to give, he was the first person to put Sex Pistols on television. He was able to put a lot of good stuff on television. You need someone like that. The only person in the 50s over here was Jack Good, who came up with the Oh Boy TV show. And he was a sole, lone figure shouting in the wilderness, saying that rock and roll was actually good and that Gene Vincent was a great talent. All of the people he went to college with, who were basically running the BBC, did not employ anybody between 1950 and 1954 who had not gone to either Oxford or Cambridge. And then when independent television, ITV, comes along in the mid-50s, it's the same thing. So the people at that time who were commenting on the Teds when they emerged, no one in their family was a teddy boy.
One of the things which you try and explode in the book is that the story that was told in the media about the Teds were these violent hooligans, and this phrase, of course, the juvenile delinquents, spongers, rowdies, spivs, hooligans. And of course, there were some incidents. Let's not, there were violent incidents, but they were blown up in the media, as the media want to sort of like paint this entire group of young people, basically,
Sure,
in a certain light.
Teddy boys, I don't like them at all. I don't like their style of dress. It's just to prove what they are, and they're very ignorant. I think if their parents watched over them a bit better when they were smaller, they might grow up to be good citizens. I blame their parents.
Junior gangsters, she calls them. But some surely just like to look tough, not act tough. Take Mike. He's 17.
About this acting tough. It's no good creeping down the road, door to door, all meek and humble, because the fellas are just going to say, well, look at that punk, let's have him.
Why did working class kids in about 1952 start dressing up in Edwardian fashions, the wealthy Edwardian fashions of just the time of Edward VII, just prior to the First World War? It's because Savile Row in the late 40s had been trying to pitch that as a fashion revival to match the very successful Edwardian fashion revival that women had been buying since 1946. Christian Dior's new look, I always call it a new look inside Granny's wardrobe, because basically it was the fashions of 1910.
So for anybody who doesn't know, Teddy Boys comes from Edwardian Ted, the Edwardian era pre-First World War.
Yeah, if you look at pictures of Edward VII, the monarch that it's all named after, he's wearing long fingertip length jackets like the Teds. He's wearing
single-breasted.
Yes, yep, embroidered waistcoats, velvet collars, and narrow trousers. Now, men's trousers since the 30s had the fashion for what were called Oxford bags, very wide. That was still prevailing right the way through the 40s and the early 50s. So basically, respectable society had these wide trousers. There's basically about 2 or 3 years of an expensive Savile Row Edwardian revival, and it was being seen in the London clubs down Pall Mall. Some of the older people in those clubs were still dressing Edwardian because they always had, because that was the styles of their youth. So what offended the establishment in the shape of the BBC and the politicians, who were all generally from those classes as well, and the people who wrote the newspapers, somebody's nicked our fashions. These oiks who are supposed to dress completely nondescript fashion, tug their forelocks and get ready for a job working a lathe. The great Teddy Boy book of 1958 is Saturday Night, Sunday Morning by Alan Sillitoe. And the character, Arthur Seaton, what does he do? He works at a lathe. That's the job you come out of school at 15 that you were supposed to. You weren't supposed to have, as the character in the novel has, a wardrobe full of very expensive tailoring that he's diverted all of his money to that.
Even if you're from a working class or lower middle class, and maybe you didn't go into manual work, maybe you had a job in a shop or something like that.
Or pushing a barrow down Water Street full of film cans, that sort of thing.
Yeah, but even then, as you pointed out earlier, as soon as you stop being a child, if you're a male, you would grow a moustache if you could.
And impersonate your dad.
Until you retired.
Yes.
Right? And,
absolutely.
you know, you wear a tie every day, but it would be a very kind of nondescript suit. Nothing to stand out.
No,
Standing out was
waves.
the great sin, right, wasn't it? Then the war's come, everything's been kicked into, you know, it's chaos, basically.
And women have gone into the factories.
Right. Let's just set the scene, because the war has just completely turned society upside down. It's threatened the landed classes.
Bankrupted the country.
Bankrupted the country.
Yeah.
You know, London itself is a sea of rubble, basically. But also you've got this new era where there's the invention of the teenager, as they say, where young people are different than their parents. And also you're getting into an era where there's going to be a bit more money around for working class kids.
The war is the cause of that, because basically if you take a large chunk of the working age male population and kill them in a war, suddenly the employers are scrabbling around looking for staff. We had pretty much full employment as the 50s started, and that's something that the employers generally hated, because you want to be able to
pick and choose.
You want people scared of losing their jobs. Both my parents left school at 15. They went straight into the workforce. And the people who were Teds, there's a group of them on the front cover of my book, and they're Tottenham Teds. They're at the Tottenham Royal Ballroom. They're about 15 and photographed for Picture Post. And they're wearing handmade suits. Why? Because you could get a job straight out of school. There were plenty of them. They had to be well paid, because the employers had to treat their staff actually well, because they wanted to keep them. Because if you didn't like the job on a Monday morning, you could walk out of it and walk into another job that afternoon. So the power was actually in the hands of the people doing the jobs. Their working class parents had been teenagers in the Depression. So jobs were incredibly scarce and badly paid.
Now you've got what we'd call disposable income.
Yes. And so imagine you're working for a living. You might be 16. You can afford to go dancing several times a week. You can afford to go and buy records. It's the high era of cinema going. Often people would go 3 or 4 times a week to the cinema. And you could go to your local backstreet tailor and say, I've just seen something in the paper. There's all these toffs wearing this velvet collar. Let's have a bit of that. And so they started doing that. And after that got publicity, the posh people who were wearing those styles dropped it like a stone.
Because they didn't want to be associated with the New York.
You mentioned there are all these reports of violence. Now, the thing is, I've worked in cinemas, I've worked in all sorts of places. And believe me, if you've worked in a cinema on the late shift on a Friday and Saturday night, most of your audience is coming in drunk. That's just how a Friday night and a Saturday night is. And a small percentage of them are going to give you trouble, up to and including pulling weapons, all sorts of things, or threatening you. And so imagine you run a dance hall and it's the 1940s, before the Teds. Some of the people who are going to come to that dance hall are not looking to just go dancing and have a nice time, but a few of them are going to be there for a fight, or to rob somebody, or get enjoyment out of picking a fight with the staff. If you were running a dance hall or part of the staff in the 40s, you just say, I hate these hooligans who show up, because hooligan had been the word, or yobs, that had been a word for a long, long time. You get into the 50s and a very large number of people, young people across the country, started dressing in these Edwardian styles. It was everywhere. You mentioned New Romantic earlier on. The people, when that really first started, you people going to the Blitz Club. If you'd have tried dressing like Spandau Ballet, where I'm from in Portsmouth, you wouldn't have got down the street, basically, in these kilts and extra. Ted's, that was a very widespread fashion. You just realise it's lurking in so many people's family albums. There were people in my family who had Teddy boys in them, and they weren't all hooligans, but if enough people are wearing that, then statistically, some of the people causing trouble at those dance halls or smashing up cinemas are going to be wearing Edwardian gear. Yeah. I was finding pre-First World War reports of people causing trouble at cinemas, smashing up seats,
This is the actual infamous thing about the Teddy Boys, and it's a specific thing because it's like the cinemas where, as you say, lots of people went to, but lots of young people went to. There's all these stories about Teddy Boys, about young hooligans kind of like causing a ruck. Yeah. Of course, then there's films that are coming over from America. Later on, there's the Rock Around the Clock, the film, isn't it? And
Blackboard Jungle, and
Blackboard
stuff
Jungle.
like that.
Teddies would go up to these films, and then as soon as the music kicked off in the films, they'd be like dancing in the aisles, and they'd be letting the fire extinguishers off. Billy Bragg told me that actually that his uncle, I think he was from Ilford or something, went to the cinema because he'd heard that this is what happened.
That's right.
And was quite disappointed actually when he went to the cinema.
John Lennon is on record. He gave an interview to Rave magazine in about 1964, reminiscing about his TED days, and he said, "Yeah, I went along to showing Rock Around the Clock, and again, I was expecting it all to kick off, and it didn't. You know, he said I was ready to slash the seats, but nobody was.
But nobody got up before me.
And
yeah.
That's
so it was a classic thing blown up by the media. But for anybody who doesn't know the look, let's just talk about the look. What is the archetypal clothes and styling?
Starting from the bottom, from ground level, very important. You've got your crepe-soled shoes, your brothel creepers,
a fat sole.
Exactly. It's not compulsory. You see photographs of original Teds from, say, 54, 53. They all look different from each other. It's like a group of mates. They've all gone to a tailor and said, I want this, I want that. So they're dictating how many pockets, quite how long the jacket is, whether they've got a velvet or collar or not, but also the shoes. If we're starting with the shoes, crepe-soled shoes, very popular since the 40s. Frank Norman, the great writer, he just after the war, literally 1946, I think, he sees the Flash Boys on the corner and he's admiring the fact that they've got draped jackets and they've got very thick crepe-soled shoes. This is 7 or 8 years before Ted's came along, but part of the look is already there.
The shoes.
Prince Philip, round about the time of the coronation, 1953, what's his favourite type of shoes? Crepe-soled suede shoes. I love old newspapers. It's advertised in the papers. You can tell, right, this was around that week, and here's what it costs, and I'm seeing this advert everywhere. So this is not an obscure thing.
Yeah, this is not a subcultural thing. So my blue suede shoes, as the song said, was actually more common than we might imagine.
Blue suede shoes show up in the book White Boys Never Work. So that's London gang culture, racetrack thugs.
Anything significant about the socks?
Socks all over the place. I mean, a lot of the great Teddy Boy photographs of those days are obviously in black and white, but you can see an absolute riot of patterns and day glow colours, you know, lurid green, lurid yellow. Men were supposed to not be noticed, therefore black socks or grey socks, and those are the only things allowed.
So you went for contrast.
So anything that would scream at you. Narrow trousers, if your average men's trouser was, say, 25 or 30 inch wide all the way down, then less than 20 inches, 15 inches would be that. And a lot of dance halls, because they'd had a few bits of trouble from people wearing that gear, and they were also obviously getting trouble from people who weren't wearing that gear, but the ones that got the attention. Then they started putting up signs, and this is before rock and roll hit over here, saying no one in Edwardian clothing admitted. The rest of your costume might be completely normal, like a normal suit, but just because the trousers were a little bit too narrow.
Trousers. Yeah.
John Peel, as a teenager, told me he bought them in Liverpool as a teenager, and he said, I never actually had the guts to wear them, but just knowing that they were there in the cupboard made me think, I am one hell of a guy. And Billy Fury talked about that in a 70s interview. His dad would not let him out of the house, working class Liverpool family, if his trousers were too narrow. So he would hide this narrow pair of trousers in the outside loo, go out wearing some normal looking gear, and then nip back round the back of their terrace house and change into them. So then you get above that. The Edwardian jackets were just longer. If you're standing up, where does the bottom of your hands come to? That's where the level of jacket. So almost like a coat, basically. And in fact, the sort of coats that people were wearing as an overcoat in 1965, the sort of light, stylish mod kind of style, or James Bond kind of Max, that would have been considered a jacket in usually single-breasted, narrow lapels. Because think of the film noir styles, you sort of double-breasted, Humphrey Bogart gangsters, double-breasted, but with very wide, pointy lapels. Often a velvet collar, because the Edwardians had velvet collars back pre-First World War, and maybe velvet on the cuffs and around the pockets. But because these were literally teenagers saying to their local tailor, I want this. So whatever they felt like, you might want to wear a bright colour, again for the same reason you might want bright socks, just to piss people off basically. But there were a lot of them wearing grey, a lot of them wearing powder blue or black. The point being, all the little details, which is, again, what the mods 5 years later, the mod clubs admiring attention. Oh, you've got, 6 buttons on that sleeve. And
shirt and tie?
Shirt and tie, yes. Maybe a bootlace tie, maybe a sort of string, just a bit of ribbon tied, a very thin tie. Contrast to the extravagances of the 40s.
The bootlace tie is also quite American, isn't it?
Yes, a lot of these things, it circles back. A lot of 19th century American styles. You think of your classic riverboat gambler with the flash waistcoat, the frock coat. Where does that come from? It comes from over here. You read American press and indeed the Australian press in the 19th century, so simultaneously trying to get away from the old country while continually looking to the cultural developments in the old country and going, oh, that's the latest fashion, we'll have that.
Another example of things going back and forward across the Atlantic.
They do, yeah.
Let's get on to got to be one of the most significant parts of the look, though. The hair. Let's talk about the hair.
The wealthy who, in the late 40s, people like Bunny Roger, who was a fashion designer, people like that, Cecil Beaton, wore Edwardian stuff, combined it with a very Edwardian touch, original Edwardian, which is a bowler hat. That was thought to be an essential part of the style if you were a Savile Row wealthy revivalist. The Teds didn't want to do that because it was all about the hair. It was rock and roll. It was the extravagant cultivation of a greased-up pompadour-style hair, particularly Tony Curtis, very important in this. You would go to your barber and say, I want a Tony Curtis.
That was a style, was it?
That was a total style. Right. If you were a men's barber and you couldn't offer a Tony Curtis by about 1953, you'd go out of business. It was so popular.
So you had to grow your hair long on top.
Yes.
And then you had to apply a lot of grease.
Yeah, and so that it's falling attractively all over your face and probably encouraging your teenage acne all over your forehead. I mean, short back and sides. I mean, I've got pictures of my great-grandfather in the First World War in the trenches, and he's got that haircut because that's what the army would do. They'd let you get away with a bit of long stuff on top, but they'd shave the sides. So the only way of really standing out a bit is to mess about with it. And hair oil had been popular since the 19th century, and you go around elderly relatives and they'd have these little sort of doily type things at the back of the sofa.
Stop you getting grease on the back of the chairs.
They're called antimacassars because Macassar was the late 19th century popular brand of hair oil. And then you think of the 1920s and 30s dance band musicians, everything slicked back with this absolute ocean of oil. So starting at your forehead, right back over the top. So to start fluffing up the front bit of it.
And with a quiff, which is actually sort of like cantilevered out the front, right? And the duck's arse at the back.
It's hilarious because the press trying to deal with the phrase DA, and they would say, yes, which stands for District Attorney. No, mate, it's duck's arse is what it stands for because it sticks out the back of your head.
Duck's tail.
So that became very important. And again, you could get into trouble at school for even showing up with your hair combed in that fashion. The army didn't like it because we're in an era of
national service.
You leave school at 15, but you knew that at 18 you were going to get compulsorily taken into the services with the Army, Navy or Air Force for 2 years of your life. The first thing they would do would be shave your head. A lot of the people in the mid-50s who were the working class recruits that were press ganged into it, they were Teds.
It's interesting because hair for the young is the way of showing who you are.
Totally. Think of the goths in the 80s. Yeah. Think of so many people. Yeah. Think of the skinheads just having a brutal style like that. Or it's a statement.
Yeah. Whereas the short back and sides or the crop look, particularly favoured by the military, means that everybody's the same. Yeah. That's the point of it in a way. Is that you erase the individuality.
Yeah. Look at the footage of Elvis being inducted into the army, where he's got one of the great haircuts of all time, and they're just happily shaving it off.
Yeah.
It's to say we own you. You know, it's very
forget all that other stuff, all the narcissistic preening and the peacocking and stuff like this.
Don't be an individual.
Don't be an individual. Now you're in the army. Yeah. I'm glad that you mentioned Elvis because I think let's talk about the American influence, particularly by music.
The Teds started out as a fashion, whereas a lot of other musical youth movements in this country, the music is there at the beginning, and the clothes are part of that.
They come later.
Yes.
Right. You might start listening to jazz in the 30s or 40s, and then you might start dressing a bit like people in band leaders or whatever.
Yeah,
right?
Or say in the 70s, like the Clash making their own clothes or the spray paint stuff. You know, get stuff from charity shops and carve it up and write slogans on it. That inspired a lot of people to follow. Whereas here, you've got the working class completely on their own as a fashion thing, taking the wealthy Edwardian revival style and making it a thing of their own.
If you ask him why he wears Edwardian clothes, he says,
well, it's definitely smarter. It definitely attracts the birds. I mean, when you put it on, it kind of gives you a superior feeling, a confidence, like, and people look at you.
ordering a new suit, that is serious. They call men who wear conventional clothes peasants. And serious, too, is a Saturday afternoon visit to the barbers. On certain days, they do certain things. 3 nights a week are reserved for their steadies. On certain nights, non-girl nights, their design for living calls for at least one visit with the gang to a pin-table saloon. Usually, Pat and Mike stick to their own gang and district. And when they do go outside, say to the teenage canteen at the Elephant and Castle, they're careful not to stare at the local girls.
Because they had money in their pockets, as I say, they had a lot of money for dancing and for buying records. And so in 1952-53, if you went out dancing to any dance hall, this is the era just before you would expect to find a DJ anywhere. The idea that you go to a club and there's somebody spinning records, that's more an early 60s thing.
Yeah, but you went to a dance hall because it was about a dance band playing.
Exactly. Dance bands, it's a bit like the Irish show bands. You're expected to play a bit of everything because the age range at the dance hall might be somebody's parents. So they would mix and match. But if something was in the charts or was popular on the radio, they would be expected to play the hits of the day, plus to play some old favourites from 20 years before or 10 years before, jazz or sort of jitterbug kind of thing. So if you were a 15-year-old Ted in 1953, you would go to your local dance hall and you would get up and be able to jive to a local band. I mean, my dad used to go to the Hammersmith Palais in the 50s. He used to go and see Joe Loss and his orchestra, who were one of the great bands, and they could play everything. And they had 2 or 3 singers with them. Some of them could handle, by that stage, the early rock and roll stuff, and other people could croon. You could do the Sinatra stuff, or you had a female singer who could be either the Vera Lynn or your Rosemary Clooney or whatever it was. But one of their singers, one of their big singers, was Ross McManus, was Elvis Costello's dad. You sat there as a 15-year-old waiting for the up-tempo
Jitterbug or
jitterbugging and
a
jive.
fast swing or jive.
That stuff exploded during the war years over here. It was very big. You ate to the bar boogie style. That was mainstream taste, and you could do these really acrobatic dances, throwing people over your shoulders. So the whole jiving style that you would associate with Ted and Teddy Girl couple dancing, by 1956, yes, that could be Bill Haley that they're doing that to, all this stuff. But they were doing that in 53 just to jazz records. So before December 1954, if you're looking at Ted's going out, they are not dancing to rock and roll. They're dancing to jazz. Yeah. But that autumn, just before the rock and roll explosion comes along, Carol Wrights and Tony Richardson went to the Wood Green Jazz Club and made a film called Mama Don't Allow. Wonderful. And you've got some posh people who show up in a Rolls Royce outside. And they're there to jive. But there are genuine teddy boys in that audience. They're dancing to the Chris Barber band. It's jazz. But who's part of that band at the time? It's Lonnie Donegan. So by the following year, he's the skiffle star, the one who influenced the Beatles and just everybody, John Peel's big hero. So it's that strange transitional time. Everything was in place, and then we heard rock and roll. So first of all with Bill Haley, and you can't underestimate how important Bill Haley.
This kind of youth quake, it wasn't just in this country. In the Soviet Union, there was a youth culture called Stilyagi, very small group of people.
Yeah.
You see photographs of them, but you mainly see them actually in satirical cartoons, which were in the press about them, right? And you look at it and you think, they look like Teds. And they had a little glimpse into what their contemporaries, their peers in the West were doing through the odd magazine, through the odd newspaper report about young people in cinemas tearing it up, dancing in the aisles, setting fire extinguishers off, and that's what inspired them. And so then they started to do a kind of slightly ersatz, bricolage, DIY version of the look. There was something in the zeitgeist of the Western world at the time of young people kind of breaking out with these similar looks, right? Particularly in the Soviet bloc. The other interesting thing in terms of what you talk about is that the words that the press used to talk about them, what were they? Hooligans, rowdies, spongers, wasters, wreckers, parasites. That was a favourite one. But basically the same sort of words were used to describe them.
Give it a bad name and hang it from the ceiling.
Here is a sidebar drawn from my upcoming book on youth cultures around the Eastern Bloc. You may have heard of the Zazus in France, jazz-loving rebels of the 1930s who defied Nazi occupation. You might have heard about the German swing kid, the teenagers who embraced American swing music despite the dangers under the Nazi regime. But have you heard of the Soviet Stolyargi, the Hungarian Jampacek, the Polish Bikinazi, the Czech Potapki or the Roman Malangisti? These groups had a lot in common with Britain's Teds and America's rock and rollers, sharing a deep love for Western music and a strong sense of identity expressed through rebellious fashion. But in the Eastern Bloc, embracing that sort of style wasn't just a fashion statement, it was an act of defiance against the communist regimes that sought to control cultural expression. In the West, the Teds and the rock and rollers were often seen as troublemakers, as we've heard, but they operated in societies where rebellion was mostly social, not political. They clashed with the authorities, but they weren't seen as direct threats to the government. Their fights were with disapproving parents, strict teachers and the occasional police officer. But for the youth of the Eastern Bloc, adopting Western styles was seen as outright opposition to the state. Communist authorities viewed them as enemies of socialist values, branding them as delinquents, even ideological traitors. They risked harassment, arrest, just for their clothes and music choices. The Soviet Stolyargi were the largest and most sophisticated of these movements. They formed an underground network to smuggle Western records, sometimes even making bootlegs by pressing music onto discarded X-ray film. You can check out my project about that. They had their own slang and distinctive style, narrow trousers, colourful ties, pomaded hair, an obsession with jazz and rock and roll. They stood out in stark contrast to the drab uniform Soviet aesthetic, making them easy targets for the police and communist youth organisations like the Komsomol. In Hungary, the Jampacek took Western influence to the dance floor. The term Jampacek likely comes from Hungarian slang for jumping, reflecting their dynamic dance culture. Rock and roll had the greatest influence here, and Jampacek gatherings often revolved around dancing competitions and underground concerts. The Polish Bikinazi were the most flamboyant dressers of all. Their name came from the bikini ties they wore, vividly coloured neckties that made them stand out in a crowd. Some sources even suggest the name referenced the controversial bikini swimsuit, a symbol of Western decadence. Their subculture was closely tied to a black market economy as they relied on smuggled Western fashion and accessories. In Czechoslovakia, there was the Potapski, sometimes called the Ducks. That name might have come from their distinctive swagger, resembling a duck's waddle, or from their tendency to dive into underground jazz clubs. They had to survive both the Nazi and the communist oppression. Under the Nazis, they risked arrest for listening to jazz, which was labelled degenerate music, and under the communists, they were harassed for their fashion. They had one of the most nuanced internal languages of any subculture, developing coded phrases to identify fellow members and avoid police attention. Then there were Romania's Malangisti, the most underground and least documented of these groups. Their name derives from a combination of mal, bad, and gamba, leg, referring to their wild dance styles. They were unique in that they had the closest ties to working class youth, rather than middle class intellectuals. They also operated under one of the most repressive regimes in the Eastern Bloc. They had to be extremely cautious. Although each of these groups had its own style and an emphasis, whether it's music, dance or fashion, they were all connected by a shared desire for individuality in a world that demanded conformity. And their Western counterparts, the Teds and the rock and rollers, might have been more focused on rebellion for rebellion's sake. But for the youth of the Eastern Bloc, every dance step, every pomaded hairstyle, and every smuggled record was an act of quiet resistance. Rock Around the Clock, it's impossible to estimate the impact of that record around the Western world.
Totally.
Right?
May 1955 he cut that. He'd been on a series of small labels. I mean, his earlier records are great. He was doing that sound for several years before that. Suddenly he's got this colossal promotion team. They're going out hitting every DJ across America, hundreds of people. They've got a decent budget. What do they cut within 2 weeks of signing the deal? They cut Rock Around the Clock.
But I think what's really important about that record, particularly, in terms of the Soviet Union is even more important, I think, than here, is that what's the message of that record? The message of that record is forget everything else. Fuck everything else.
Yeah.
Let's party.
Exactly.
Right? All night.
Yeah.
You know, that's the message.
Totally.
Which, of course, in terms of juvenile delinquency, is an unwelcome message for the older generation, right? But for a young person, it's exactly what you want to hear at the time.
It is.
So,
It's a hedonistic message. It's a very joyful message, and it's a very liberating message. It was a slow burner. Its big success was in 1955 on the back of the Blackboard Jungle film, where it was the opening title music. So it had been a low-level thing in the British charts for about 2 weeks at the beginning of 1955. And in the autumn of 55, suddenly we got the film Blackboard Jungle. There's a great interview with Keith Richards, a Rolling Stone interview from 1972, and he's reminiscing about what fired him up to want to play the guitar. And he said, for him and all his mates, going to one of these big cinemas, 4,000 people, 4,000 teenagers. You might have a little dance set at home, but it's not going to sound like this. This colossal great hall, curtains open, the lights go down, and you hear Rock Around the Clock at deafening volume, an electric guitar, the slap double bass. They'd never heard anything like that. And he said, everybody came out of that, they talked to their mates, and nobody talked about the film, he said. Everybody just went, did you hear that music, man? And so it became a hit on the back of the film, not just in this country, but worldwide. And there were attempts to bring him over in 56. 56, a pivotal year, because that's when we first heard Heartbreak Hotel, Bebop Lula. Following year, Jerry Lee Lewis, Eddie Cochran. But really, rock and roll started dominating the charts in the second half of 1956. So Bill Haley arrives in the spring of 57 to an audience of teenagers that are absolutely insanely in love with American rock and roll, and for whom Bill was the first thing that they'd heard. And the scenes of mayhem that greeted the Bill Haley tour. And a lot of important people saw it. You know, I mean, the Beatles went to see that. Malcolm McLaren saw one of the shows, etc., etc. Half the Stones were at those shows.
So you've got what's called, you might call it the youthquake, right? Where, to the great alarm of the older generations in the establishment, you've got this energy, but maybe partly sexual energy, or partly just the energy of being, you know, young and free and out and about. So the Teddies adopted the rock and roll. The rock and roll didn't come first, so that basically becomes their soundtrack.
It does, because rock and roll was being sneered at and demonised in the same way that the Teds had been, and by the same people. The newspaper people, often written by people who'd been to public schools and Oxford and Cambridge, but also by the jazz establishment, particularly Melody Maker, the oldest jazz magazine in the world, 1926. And the people writing for that, they really knew their jazz. They were great supporters of that, but they couldn't see that the ridiculous abuse they were handing out to rock and roll was exactly the kind of prejudice that jazz had run into in the 20s.
And it's also the prejudice that is going to fire young people up.
Yes.
If the older establishment is writing you off, what does it make you do? Okay, we're going to do more of that.
Totally.
And of course, so you've got 3 chords in a song rather than 12 in a jazz song. And these people weren't going for the sort of technical ability of the jazzers. They were going for raw energy, right? Yeah. The electric guitar, the pounding snare. So this thing comes over really from the States, and it provides them with their soundtrack. And so it unleashes this youthful energy. And with that comes, some violence and the wrecking of the cinemas and these incidents. One of the things that we've omitted, which we must include, Teddy Girls.
Yes.
Because, and particularly when it comes to the look, I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes. There's a great photo shoot by Ken Russell. Yep. Let's have a visual description of what a Teddy girl would be wearing.
They would wear, say, the sort of jackets they had, velvet collar, very much nipped in at the waist and flaring out from that, a short jacket. They liked cameo brooches, so you'd wear a nice ruffled white shirt, but held with a silk ribbon held by a vintage cameo brooch at the neck.
Maybe a scarf.
Yes, or a scarf. A lot of them wore trousers, which, again, for a woman in the 50s, that was radical. I mean, obviously, Marlene Dietrich had been down that route in the 30s, but it still was enough to shock people. Some of them that Ken Russell photographed, and I don't know quite where they got this from, the Chinese sort of peasant hats, the sort of pointed ones.
And also these sort of almost like Chinese or possibly ballet slippers as well, right?
Yeah.
Great for dancing.
Yeah, exactly.
And quite sharp shoulders.
Yes. That's a very 40s thing, but I found an advert for in Vanity Fair, the sort of thing you'd expect people with money to be reading. Harrods full-page advert from 1952, which is just pre-Teddy Boy, and they're selling a jacket just like the ones these Teddy girls are wearing, with the velvet collar, the nipped-in waist, beautiful-looking jacket, narrow sleeves, and they're selling it for like 35 guineas. Okay, how much is that? That's about 40 quid. What's 40 quid? Well, you could fly there and back to Paris first class for 12 quid at that time. So a hotel room might cost you £3. So that's a lot of money. Again, it's the same as with the Teddy Boys. The fashions were around. These girls they'd have been reading the fashion magazines. They'd have been also watching Teddy Boys. There's an element of the Teddy girls wanting a bit of the action. They like the way their boyfriends are dressing. And they think, hang on a minute, I don't have to look like my mum. I can look glamorous, you know.
Yeah, and very sharp. I think that's the thing which you
sharp.
notice here. It looks super sharp. In terms of drawing to the end of the Teddy Boy era, now we can talk about revivals and how it, different places where it actually hung around, but it did start to fade out, didn't it? And we get replaced maybe by mod, in terms of working class fashion.
Yes.
Right.
There are definite instances of people who had been in to the whole Teddy Boy clothing look by the end of the 50s becoming... the early mods were called modernists. I mean, this whole Parker thing is, I get that if it's 1963 and you don't want oil over your expensive suit and you're on a Lambretta, which is chucking oil everywhere, fine. But the modernists were dressing in sharp Italian style. And they were around by 1958, definitely. So the narrow trousers that the Teds had, great, but shorter jackets, became known over here as bum freezer jackets. Any youth movement, think of, hippies. I remember hippies by 1973. That's only 6 years after your Summer of Love. They were regarded in my local circles as a bit of a joke.
I think this is what's significant about this. If you see the Teddy Boys or the Teddy Girls, the Teddy culture is one of the first kind of youth cultures with the fashion associated with it in the UK. Because the characteristic of youth culture is that it's quite brutal in the way that it changes. And as those youths grow up, right, and are replaced by a younger generation who want to distinguish themselves from their older brothers and sisters, and so of course there's some new influences are coming in, particularly in terms of music, right, as well, and drugs.
Let's not forget that the original Teds were then put through the mincer of national service. Right. Everybody, Teds and Teddy girls, you were supposed to be married as a late teenager or 20. And there's interviews, Picture Post interviewed a whole bunch of Teds in a Bristol dance hall in about 1953. And they said, yeah, we're enjoying this. This is good. Suppose we'll be out of it in a couple of years and we'll be married and settled down and, have to take life seriously.
Girls are the number one topic of conversation. We often discuss marriage. They don't much like the idea of it, but are afraid they'll come to it in the end.
10 years' time, what would I be like? Well, I suppose I'll be married. I don't want to get married, but I suppose I will. Couple of kids, working for a living, finishing at up arse 5, going home.
My mum was a teenager in the 50s. She had 3 sisters. All 4 of them were married before the age of 20. And that was normal in their sort of working class. There was a sort of whispering that, oh, you're still on the shelf. Oh, you're not married yet. So the pressure on most of those Teddy girls who were photographed by Ken Russell, a couple of years later, they had got married. These were not wild juvenile delinquents. They settled down to what society would have said a respectable family life. By the time I was a sort of rebellious teenager in the 70s, I had the advantage that my parents, having been rock and roll, they might not have necessarily understand the music, but they'd seen it all before. They understood the impulse. They knew what I was doing.
Well, that's what it's about. It's about the impulse, isn't it? And so a new generation, a new look comes along, new music comes along, new drugs come along. In the 60s, society's changing pretty radically again.
Think of what rock bands looked like in 65 to what they look like by 67. Once the Afghan coats come in and the Beatles starting to grow, lots of facial furniture and long hair. It's totally different.
So Barry Kane did Flexi Pop magazine. Very early interviewee on this show, but he told me something funny which I thought you'd enjoy, because he was a working class kid, but born in Islington, worked on Chapel Market on a stall which sold pets. But he said something interesting to me about the impact of the new architecture on fashion, because he said very early morning, but it might have even been a late Ted, but he said when they were started knocking in the terraced houses and building the council flats, and his own family moved from a a really horrible, squalid terraced house into a council flat.
Yeah.
He said it was the first time that you could have a full-length mirror, so you could check out your look before you went out from top to toe. So he said for him and his mates, it was absolutely crucial that before you left the house that you were absolutely pucker from top to bottom. You know.
I mean, in terms of fashion, the Italian thing came in. La Dolce Vita, literally the film, just as the 60s started. The fashions people saw and the lifestyle, the whole riding a Vespa or whatever. And then in 62, you've got the first Bond film. I mean, the first Bond film, Dr. No, and the first Beatles single come out within about a week of each other.
And so the Beatles, who themselves have been teddy boys, quite quickly changed their look, right?
They did. But you've got a couple of male role models there. The way the Beatles were dressing, but you've also got the way they dressed Sean Connery in the first one. Very nice. Again, it's a move away from the 50s then, but everyone had a horror of looking old-fashioned. And if you were wearing literally last year's thing, I remember that from being a kid in the 60s. The new styles would come in and you'd see people's parents wearing them, even if it didn't suit them. These really short skirts. You can see it. You watch Carry On films. It's not even the older actresses are wearing much higher hemlines than they would have done. And the hairstyles follow suit.
And with Ted, there's been various revivals down the years. You could also, McLaren and Westwood, particularly in the sort of 70s in the punk thing, introducing that look as well and mixing it up with the punk.
All the glam rock people.
Shwaddy Waddy and the other groups in the 70s.
Shwaddy Waddy are sort of impersonators, but the genuine people who loved that stuff, Roy Wood in Wizard, I mean, he came out of The Move. The Move's got a huge, huge 50s input there. There's footage of them on television in like 69 doing a total 1950s thing.
Unlike mod, which keeps coming back in the thing with the Britpop era, people wear mod style clothes now. Ted hasn't had the same thing, and I wonder whether it's because it is quite exaggerated. In some ways, it's quite cartoony.
Pete Townsend at the beginning of The Who, and he's singing the praises of mod styles and mod fashions. And he said a good mate of his has these really sharp mod suits, but he works as a bank clerk, and he can go in to work in that suit, and it's not a problem. It's so close to what respectable society would have mistaken for complete respectability. They're not seeing the little tweaks and points of interest in a mod suit that only another mod would even know. The eye makeup that a lot of mods used to wear. They're just seeing, oh, he's smart, he's wearing a suit. As you say, the Ted fashion was more in your face. It was more an exaggeration of something, and therefore it stood out. Whereas mods were the styles that they were perfecting. The women almost didn't get a look in. It was just the blokes staring at the other blokes and going, oh, look, he's got 3 buttons on that. Teddy boys showed the way. And as the abuse they got is because they were the first ones to stick their head over the parapet. Yeah, if you're going to dress in that gear and walk out the door, you've already had some verbal from your parents. You're not going out dressed like that. And then you get out in the street and people might laugh at you, people might admire you, people might hit you. And they blazed a trail for everybody since then. That rite of passage that everybody in the youth movement had over here in the punk days in Portsmouth, just getting to the venue was a real achievement. Once you were inside the venue, it was a safe space. It was fine. I never had any trouble inside.
It's a nice problem to have, but one of the things which has changed in the world these days, well, certainly in a place like London where we are now, and I'm sure in most cities, you can kind of wear what you want. If you walk down Brick Lane, I love it. You'll see the strangest outfit. You'll see somebody dressed like a Tudor. For instance, we saw a guy recently. He actually had a cat on his shoulder, a real cat, an incredible outfit. Certainly in the East End now, and nobody's going to even blink an eyelid.
They might just assume, oh, he's been to a stag night and hasn't got, dressed up in a funny. If you can wear a sort of animal print onesie and walk down the street, and that would have got you killed in Portsmouth in the 70s, it really would. And some would say rightly so.
So I think there's certain things we can celebrate, and what I'd like to celebrate is this wonderful book, Teddy Boys, Post-War Britain and the First Youth Revolution. Thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Oh, you're a gentleman. Thank you. That was a lot of fun. Thanks for asking me.
Thanks very much to Max, who was looking very rock and roll and has a wonderful new album out. I'll put links to that and to his books and his other work in the notes. I think I might ask him back to talk about King's Road, that street of dreams in the 1960s, although it's now rather a sad, bland place for wealthy people to buy expensive, boring stuff. Speaking of that, I was really struck by the theme that much of British youth fashion emerged from the working class. I suppose you had the middle class and the art school class in the 60s and 70s until punk. And we're definitely multicultural when it comes to fashion these days. I mean, you still see goths about, but most of the old divisions between genres and styles have dissolved. As I mentioned, take a walk down Brick Lane in London any weekend and you'll witness our wonderful, crazy potpourri of individual styles. I like a bit of mod myself. Single-breasted, 3-button blazer, slim trousers, smart shoes. What about you? Thanks for listening. Let's keep listening. I will see you down the road, round the bend and over the hillsides for more tales from the underground and the counterculture. Here's a bit of rock and roll to end with. It's King of the Village Fate by Lazarus and the Plane Crash.
What's the mess wife are waiting for? I'm the king of the village. Hey. Look what crawled out of the river, it's me. Lean meat and our pointy feet, well that's me. Like the ring of a bell, like the crossbow of William Tell. I'm so skinny, I'm so long, like I've been drawn by Edward Lear. I'll tell you everything you ever wanted to hear about yourself. I'll improve the state of your mental health. I'll trim your hedges in the shape of a chicken. You got a clit, well I'll give it some licking. I'm the professor, I'm Edward the confessor. I'm wearing pantaloons and burning petrol. 8 foot tall, I designed or rebuilt St. Paul. Best man's knees you ever seen. I'm spirited and I'm a professor of the obscene, and I know everything. I'm Mandy, I'm a desperate Danley. I'm Bruce Lee, I'm a fucking Christmas tree. I'm the king of the